Elias Hawthorne trudged through the Wyoming snow, his boots sinking deep into drifts as the blizzard roared like a wounded beast across the plains. The wind tore at his heavy coat, its icy fingers clawing at the grief he'd carried for 10 years. Ever since outlaws stole his wife, Clara, and their son, Jonah, in a betrayal that left his heart as barren as the frozen land. At 48, Elias was a shadow of the man who once surveyed mountains to build bridges, his face now a map of sorrow, each line carved by memories of Clara's laughter and Jonah's wide-eyed wonder at the world. His ranch, tucked in a remote valley, was his fortress, its high fences and reinforced cabin, a testament to his vow to shut out the world that had taken everything. He herded his cattle into the barn, their lowing a faint comfort against the storm's fury, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd lived alone too long. Clara's voice haunted him as he worked, her gentle scolding about his stubborn mistrust, her belief that kindness was the bridge between souls. He'd buried that belief with her, choosing solitude over the risk of pain, speaking only to his livestock and the wind that carried his regrets. The barn secured, Elias turned toward the cabin, its single lantern a dim glow in the whiteout, promising warmth but never peace. Inside, the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on walls lined with tool shovels, axes, and a surveyor's compass he hadn't touched since Jonah used to beg to hold it. He sank into his worn chair, the silence heavy, broken only by the storm's relentless howl and the creak of the cabin settling under its weight. 10 years of isolation had honed his instincts, sharpened by nights spent with a rifle close, one eye open for threats that never came. He sipped bitter coffee, the taste grounding him in the present, but his mind drifted to Clara's smile, to Jonah's small hand in his as they named the stars now hidden by the blizzard. The world beyond his fence was a ghost he'd banished, its people as distant as the life he'd once dreamed of, a life of building, not hiding. Then a knock shattered the quiet, not the wind's random assault, but a sharp, desperate plea that set his pulse racing. He froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips, his other hand inching toward the Winchester above the mantel, its cold steel a reminder of the last time strangers came in the night. The knock came again, harder, urgent, carrying voices, women's voices, speaking in Cheyenne, a language he hadn't heard since Clara sang its lullabies to Jonah. His blood ran cold, memories of that fatal morning flooding back, the outlaws, false smiles, the gunfire, the silence that followed. He stood, the rifle heavy in his grip, every instinct screaming to ignore the sound, to let the storm swallow whoever dared approach his sanctuary. Yet the voices persisted, not threatening, but pleading, their tone cutting through the walls he'd built around his heart. Clara's words echoed in his mind. "Kindness is what makes us human," she'd said, her eyes bright with a faith he'd lost. He moved toward the door, each step a battle between fear and the faint pull of something he thought long dead compassion. The knocks grew frantic, the voices clearer, speaking of shelter, of survival, their desperation a mirror to the storm's rage. Elias pressed a hand against the oak door, feeling its solid weight, the barrier between his solitude and the unknown. 10 years ago, he'd opened his home to strangers and lost everything. Now, the choice loomed again, heavier than the rifle in his hands. The Cheyenne words carried a rhythm like Clara's songs, stirring memories of her urging him to trust, to help, to live beyond his fears. His fingers hovered over the iron bolt, rusted from disuse, as the storm seemed to pause, waiting for his decision. Outside, the voices grew fainter, weakened by cold or despair, and Elias felt a pang he couldn't name: guilt, perhaps, or the ghost of the man he used to be. He pictured Jonah's small boots by the hearth, Clara's shawl still folded in, a trunk he never opened. The knocks were softer now, almost resigned, as if the callers knew their fate rested on a stranger's mercy. Elias's heart thudded, torn between the safety of his lonely world and the risk of opening his door to the pain of others. The rifle felt like an anchor, grounding him in suspicion. But Clara's voice whispered louder, her faith in him, a warmth the fire couldn't match. The knocks grew fainter, swallowed by the blizzard's wail. But Elias Hawthorne's hand lingered on the iron bolt, his breath shallow as the voices beyond his door stirred memories he'd tried to bury. He cracked the door an inch, the rifle steady in his grip, and peered into the storm, where 10 Cheyenne women stood huddled against his porch, their figures ghostly in the lantern's dim glow. Their dresses were torn, soaked with snow and streaked with dark stained blood, mud, or both, and their faces bore the weight of fear and defiance. Leading them was Kiona, a woman in her 30s, her dark eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. Carved into her features, a gash above her brow dripping red into the snow. She spoke in English, her voice steady but laced with urgency, pleading for shelter from men who hunted them like animals. Elias's heart thudded. Clara's words echoing kindness is what makes us human. But the rifle trembled, his old wounds screaming of betrayal. The youngest, Nita, barely 16, clutched a bundle that stirred faintly, a baby's weak cry cutting through the wind, while the eldest, Sonny, stood protectively close, her silver-streaked hair plastered to her face. Kiona stepped forward, her chin raised, and met Elias's gaze through the narrow gap, her words deliberate, carved from necessity. They'd been running for days, their village burned, their men slaughtered by a militia led by Captain Vance, a man who'd left more than ashes in his wake. Elias felt the weight of his solitude, 10 years of silence pressing against the sight of these women, their desperation a mirror to the night he'd lost everything. He thought of Clara, how she'd have flung the door wide, her heart open where his had closed. The baby's cry came again, fainter, and Elias's resolve wavered, the memory of Jonah's small hand in his tightening his throat. Kiona's voice softened, not begging but stating a truth. If they died at his gate, the men chasing them would come for him next, their blood tying him to their fate. Elias's fingers tightened on the bolt, the rust flaking under his touch. Each second a battle between the hermit he'd become and the man Clara had loved. He swung the door open, the storm rushing in, and stepped back, his voice rough as he said, "Come in, quick." The women moved like shadows, filing past him into the cabin's warmth, their presence shrinking the space that had been his world for a decade. Nita cradled her baby close, its pale lips trembling, while Sani guided the others, her calm an anchor in their fear. Kiona was last, pausing as she passed Elias, her eyes searching his, seeing the grief he wore like armor. She whispered thanks, but her tone carried a warning. The men hunting them were close, drawn by the smoke curling from his chimney. Elias barred the door, the iron sliding home with a clang that felt final, his sanctuary breached not by force, but by a choice he hadn't made since Clara's death. The women filled his main room, their ragged breathing and the scent of wet wool and blood overwhelming the familiar smells of wood smoke and solitude. Nita knelt by the fire, rocking her child, while others tore strips from their dresses to bind wounds, their movements practiced, resilient. Elias stood by the door, rifle still in hand, watching these strangers who'd brought life back into his tomb of a home. Kiona approached, her torn dress revealing a knife strapped to her thigh, a hint of the strength beneath her plea. She spoke softly, explaining their flight from a massacre, how Vance's militia had burned their homes, killed their families, and worse, one of their own, a young woman, bore scars from Vance's cruelty that went beyond flesh. Elias' stomach churned, the memory of outlaws who'd smiled before they killed flashing in his mind. He wanted to ask why they'd come here, why his ranch, but the baby's weak cough stopped him, its fragility a call louder than any question. Clara's voice whispered again, urging him to see the humanity in these women, to remember the man who'd once built bridges to connect, not walls to divide. Kiona's gaze held his, unflinching, and he saw in her the same pain he carried. A loss that hadn't broken her, but forged her into something harder. The firelight danced on there. Faces revealing stories of survival in every glance, every scar. Elias felt his solitude cracking, the weight of 10 years shifting under the presence of these women who'd chosen his door in a storm that could kill. Outside, the wind began to quiet, the blizzard's roar softening, and with it, the cover that had hidden their approach. A distant sound hooves, muffled but growing closer, sent a chill through him. Kiona's eyes narrowed, her hand resting on her knife, and Elias knew the choice he'd made was only the beginning. The men hunting them were near, and the night was far from over. Elias Hawthorne stood by the barred door, the weight of his rifle grounding him as the Cheyenne women settled uneasily in his cabin, their presence a stark contrast to the decade of silence that had defined his life. Kiona's dark eyes met his, her voice low as she recounted their flight from a burned village, their men cut down by Captain Vance's militia, who branded them rebels to mask their own savagery. The firelight flickered over the women's faces. Nita, cradling her frail infant, whose faint whimpers pierced Elias's heart like a blade. Sani, the eldest, binding a younger woman's gashed arm with steady hands. And others, their torn dresses hiding knives and resolve that belied their desperate plea at his door. Elias felt Clara's memory stir, her belief in helping others clashing with the fear that had kept him isolated since her death. Kiona's warning hung heavy. Vance's men were close, drawn by the cabin's chimney smoke, their pursuit relentless after days of hunting these women across the frozen plains. The storm outside was softening, its howl giving way to an eerie quiet that exposed the distant thud of hooves, too close, too many. Elias's gaze darted to the window, where snowflakes danced in the lantern's glow, and he knew the blizzard's cover was fading, leaving them exposed. He moved to a trapdoor beneath the kitchen rug, revealing a root cellar carved into the earth, its stone walls a hiding place he'd built for threats like this. "It's tight, but it'll hold you all," he said, voice rough with urgency. But Kiona shook her head, her knife glinting as she adjusted her stance. "Hiding means death when they find us, and they will," she said, her tone hard with certainty born of survival. "We chose your ranch for its hill, its choke points. We fight here, or we die running." Elias's chest tightened, the memory of Clara's death at the hands of men he trusted flashing vivid. Yet these women, strangers, looked to him not for pity but for alliance. Nita's baby coughed, a weak sound that echoed Jonah's last fevered cries, and Elias felt something shift, a crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. Kiona knelt beside Nita, whispering in Cheyenne, her hand gentle on the girl's shoulder, but her eyes never left Elias, measuring him, seeking the man beneath the hermit. "Vance wants us dead because we know what he did," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she gestured to a young woman, Tala, whose hollow gaze spoke of horrors unspoken. "He burned our homes, killed our men, and took what he wanted from, and then called us hostiles to cover his shame." Azi's grip on the rifle tightened, rage flaring at the thought of men in uniform preying on the innocent, a betrayal too close to his own past. He glanced at the cellar again, then at the women, some now checking hidden blades, their movements practiced, not those of victims but of warriors who'd chosen this ground. "How many are coming?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. 10, maybe 12. Kiona replied, standing, her torn dress revealing scars that matched her resolve. "Vance leads them, but he's no soldier his men follow out of fear or greed, not loyalty." Elias nodded, his mind racing back to his surveyor days when he mapped terrain for battles as well as bridges, seeing his ranch's hill as a defensible ridge, its slopes a trap for the unwary. The hooves grew louder, voices now audible. through the thinning storm harsh, commanding, certain of their prey. Kiauna's women moved without panic, some tending wounds, others positioning themselves near windows, their silence a testament to their readiness. Elias felt the weight of his choice to open the door, knowing it had tethered his fate to theirs, just as Clara's kindness had once tethered him to hope. He pointed to the cellar again, but Kiauna's gaze held firm. "If we hide, you die with us when they search," she said. "If we fight, we end this tonight." The fire popped, casting shadows that danced like ghosts, and Elias saw Jonah's face in the flames, his son's trust in him a reminder of the man he'd buried. Outside, a shout cut through the night, Vance's voice, arrogant, demanding surrender. Elias's jaw clenched, the rifle a familiar weight, but Kiauna's hand on his arm stopped him. "They think we're broken, scared," she said, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Let them come closer." The hooves stopped, replaced by the crunch of boots in snow, and Elias knew the night was about to ignite, his sanctuary no longer a refuge, but a battlefield, where ghosts of his past and the women's fight for survival would collide. The cabin's air grew thick with tension as Elias Hawthorne stood shoulder to shoulder with Kiauna, the Cheyenne women's quiet resolve filling the space where his solitude once reigned. Outside, Captain Vance's voice bellowed through the thinning blizzard, demanding surrender, his men's boots crunching closer in the snow, their rifles glinting in the faint moonlight. Kiauna's eyes burned with a fire that matched the one in Elias's hearth, her voice low as she revealed their plan. They'd chosen his ranch for its elevated position, its slopes and natural choke point to lure Vance's militia into a trap. Elias's heart pounded, the memory of Clara's gentle faith warring with the cold clarity of a man who'd once planned ambush during the war, his surveyor's mind mapping the terrain, his hill, his fences, his home, now a battlefield. Kiauna's women moved with purpose, Mita tucking her baby into a corner with Sani's watchful guard, while Tala and others checked hidden knives, their faces set with the grim determination of those who'd survived too much to yield. Elias felt the weight of his choice to open the door, the rifle in his hands a lifeline to a past he'd tried to bury, when he'd fought not for vengeance, but for survival. Kiauna knelt beside him, sketching a quick plan in the dirt floor. They'd feign panic, draw Vance's men into a frontal assault, while Elias and 3 women flanked through the back, using the snowy terrain he knew like his own scars. He nodded, his mind racing to a cabinet he hadn't opened in years, pulling out oil claws that hid tools of his old trade caltrops, tripwires, and dynamite from his days blasting mountain passes. "This hill's a death trap if you know how to use it," he said, handing Kiauna a bundle of fuses, her nod a silent pact. The women at the front began their ruse, overturning furniture, shouting in mock fear, their voices carrying into the night, to bait Vance's men closer. Elias led Tala, Awi, and Mika out the back, the storm's dying breath masking their steps as they crept through snowdrifts toward the malicious flank. The cold bit at his fingers, but Clara's memory warmed him, her belief that courage was a choice pushing him forward. Vance's men, 10 strong, spread out in a sloppy line, their arrogance clear in their careless advance, expecting frightened women and a lone rancher. Elias signaled, and always set a tripwire across a narrow path, its thin cord invisible in the snow, while Tala positioned caltrops where horses might tread. The first scream came minutes later, a militiaman's leg snapped by a hidden trap, his cry drawing others into the chaos. Elias and the women struck, silent as wolves, Tala's knife finding a throat before the man could shout, Mika's bow hidden beneath her dress felling another with a whisper of an arrow. Elias fired his Winchester, the shot precise, dropping a man by the barn, but the crack of gunfire shattered the night's deception. Vance's voice roared, ordering a charge, and the cabin shook as his men battered the front door. Inside, Kiauna's group fought back, their blades and stolen pistols turning the assault into a slaughter. the storm muffling the sounds of death. Elias's heart raced, not with fear, but with a clarity he hadn't felt in a decade. Each move a step toward reclaiming the man he'd been before grief made him a hermit. But as the last of Vance's men fell, a new sound froze his blood more. Hooves, heavier, more disciplined, thundering from the valley below. Kiona appeared at the back door, blood on her knife, her eyes wide with alarm. "Vance was the scout," she whispered, her voice steady despite the dread. "That's the main force Harlan's men, maybe 20. Elias cursed under his breath, the dynamite in his hand suddenly heavy, its fuses a promise of destruction he'd hoped to avoid. The women regrouped, Sani dragging a wounded Awi inside, Nita's baby crying softly as the firelight cast their shadows long and jagged. Elias scanned his ranch, his home, now scarred with blood and broken wood, and saw the hill's advantage fading against a larger force. Kiona's hand gripped his arm, her voice fierce. "We end this here, or they hunt us forever." Elias nodded, his mind flashing to Jonah's laughter, Clara's touch, and the women who'd brought life back to his doorstep. The approaching riders shouted orders, their torches flickering like eyes in the dark, and Elias knew the fight was far from over. His ranch, his refuge, was now a crucible, and the choice to fight alongside these women had bound him to there. Fate, just as Clara's kindness had once bound him to hope. The night held its breath, waiting for their next move. The cabin trembled under the weight of approaching hooves, the flicker of torches closing in like a noose as Elias Hawthorne crouched beside Kiona. The Cheyenne women's bloodied resolve a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The storm had dwindled to a soft flurry, exposing the ranch to Major Harlan's militia 20 riders, maybe more, their disciplined advance a far cry from Vance's reckless charge. Kiona's eyes burned with defiance, but her voice carried a new edge as she whispered, "Harlan uses civilians as shields, women, children, to break resistance." Elias's stomach churned, his mind flashing to Clara's lifeless form, Jonah's small body beside her, victims of men who hid cruelty behind authority. The women inside moved swiftly, Sani tending Awi's wounds while Nita hushed her babies. Cries, the infant's frail breaths a reminder of what was at stake. Tala, her face etched with the pain of Vance's brutality, gripped her knife, ready to fight despite the odds. Elias clutched the dynamite, its fuses a temptation to end this by flooding the valley, but a new sound stopped him cold, a child's cry, not Nita's baby, but another, piercing the night from a wagon near Harlan's advancing line. It was a girl, no older than Jonah had been, her wail carrying the same terror Elias had heard a decade ago. Kiona's gaze hardened, suspecting a trap, but Elias shook his head, the cry too raw, too real to be a soldier's ruse. "We can't." "Blow the dam," he said, setting the explosives down, his voice steady despite the weight of the choice. "Not with a child out there." Tala hissed, her voice sharp. "My sister's life matters as much as that one. Harlan will kill us all if we hesitate." Elias met her eyes, seeing the same pain he carried, and nodded, understanding her fear, but clinging to Clara's belief that some lines couldn't be crossed. He proposed a new plan, riskier, more desperate. Draw Harlan's men into a bottleneck. At the frozen creek below the ranch, where the terrain and his old traps could even the odds. Kiona hesitated, her hand on her knife, but the child's cry came again, weaker, and she agreed, her voice low. "We make them think we're trapped. Overconfident, they'll send half to flush us out, leaving the rest with the horses and that wagon." Elias's mind raced, recalling the creek's icy banks, its narrow path lined with bear traps and cow traps he'd set years ago to protect his solitude. He led Kiona, Tala, and Mika to the back door, while Sani and the others prepared to hold. The cabin, their shouts and gunfire meant to mimic a last stand. The snow crunched underfoot as Elias's group slipped into the darkness, the child's cries guiding them toward the wagon, where a young woman, Lila, a camp follower, huddled, with her daughter, trapped between Harlan's men and the fight. Elias signaled for silence, his rifle ready, as they crept closer, spotting 3 guards near the wagon, their attention on the cabin's chaos. Tala's knife flashed, silencing one guard before he could shout, while Mika's arrow took another. Their movements swift and silent, honed by days of survival. Elias approached Lila, his voice calm but urgent. "We're getting you outrun for the trees when I say." Her eyes, wide with terror, clung to her daughter, who clutched a rag doll, her sobs muffled against her mother's chest. The cabin erupted. In gunfire, Kiona's diversion drawing Harlan's main force, but a shout from the wagon's remaining guard broke the night. Elias struck, his rifle butt felling the man, but not before the alarm spread. Hooves thundered closer, Harlan's voice barking orders, his men tightening their circle around the ranch. Elias grabbed Lila's arm, pointing to the grove. "Run now. Follow the creek to the trading post. Tell them Elias sent you." She nodded, clutching her daughter, and vanished into the snow. But as Elias turned back, a new sound froze him silence from the cabin. The gunfire stopped, either a victory or a slaughter. Kiona's face was grim, her knife bloodied, as she whispered, "We've got minutes before Harlan's men regroup." Elias's heart pounded. The child's escape, a small victory. But the cost was clear. 2 of Kiona's women lay still in the cabin, their sacrifice buying time. Tala's eyes blazed, her voice bitter. "If we fail, their deaths mean nothing. Harlan will call us savages to justify more blood." Elias nodded, his mind sharpening, the surveyor in him seeing the creek as their last stand, its banks a trap for Harlan's overconfidence. He led the women toward the bottleneck, setting caltrops and tripwires in the dark, each step a defiance of the fear that had kept him alone for 10 years. Clara's voice whispered, her faith in him a beacon, urging him to fight not for vengeance, but for the lives in his care. The torches closed in, Harlan's men shouting, unaware of the ground they tread, and Elias felt a flicker of hope. These women, this child, had rekindled something he thought lost, a purpose worth dying for. Dawn broke over Elias Hawthorne's scarred Wyoming ranch, painting the snow in hues of gold and crimson, a fitting shroud for a night that had ended one war and birthed another. The creek's icy banks lay strewn with the aftermath of Battle Harlan's militia, caught in the bottleneck of Elias's traps, had fallen to the Cheyenne women's blades and his own precise rifle shots, their overconfidence shattered by caltrops and tripwires hidden in the snow. Kiona stood beside him, her knife still slick with blood, her face a mask of exhaustion and triumph as she surveyed the fallen, her sister's sacrifices etched in her eyes. Tala, her hands trembling, but resolute, bound a wound on Mika's arm, while Sani cradled Nita's baby, the infant's soft cries a fragile thread of hope amid the carnage. Elias's cabin, his sanctuary for a decade, was a ruin, its door splintered, windows shattered, the floor stained with the blood of Vance's men and 2 of Keona's own, who'd given their lives to hold the line. The child from the wagon, Lila's daughter, was safe, her mother's footsteps long faded into the grove, carrying Elias's name to the trading post as a promise of protection. But the victory was bittersweet, a silence after the gunfire heavy with the cost of survival. As the sun climbed, new hooves thundered, not Harlan's men, but federal marshals, their badges glinting under fur-lined coats, drawn by whispers of the Major's brutal campaign against the Cheyenne. Elias's heart thudded, the rifle still, warm in his hands as Keona whispered, "They could be our salvation or our end." The marshal's leader, a grizzled man named Carver, dismounted, his eyes scanning the wreckage with a mix of horror and understanding. Elias stepped forward, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest, recounting the night Vance's massacre, Harlan's ambush, the women's defiance, and the child they'd saved. Keona added her voice, her English sharp and unflinching, detailing the burned village, the murdered men, and Tala's unspoken scars, her words a blade cutting through the marshal's skepticism. Tala, her gaze hollow but fierce, stepped forward, her voice breaking as she spoke of Harlan's men, their laughter as they torched her home, their hands on her body, a truth that made Carver's jaw tighten. The marshals listened, their notebooks filling with accounts that reached beyond Harlan, implicating officers who turned a blind eye to slaughter for profit and power. Elias felt Clara's presence, her faith in justice a warmth against the cold reality of his destroyed home. Harlan, wounded but alive, was dragged from the creek's edge, his uniform torn, his arrogance replaced by fear as his own men, swayed by Tala's testimony and the sight of their fallen, turned against him. One, a young corporal named Ellis, confessed to the marshals, his voice shaking as he admitted to following orders he knew were wrong, his words a crack in the militia's lies. Elias saw Jonah in the boy's eyes, a reminder of the innocence he'd lost, and felt a pang of hope-truth could be a weapon sharper than any blade. Keona's women, granted protection by Carver's authority, prepared to leave, their faces weary but unbroken, their bags packed with what little the marshals could offer as compensation for their losses. Nita's baby, stronger now in the dawns. Light, nestled against her mother, a symbol of the life they'd fought for. Elias stood in his ruined doorway, watching Keona organize her people, her strength a mirror to the woman Clara had been, her resolve a challenge to the hermit he'd become. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice rough with the weight of the night. "North," Keona replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. "To kin who escaped Harlan's raids. We'll rebuild, but not here, not on blood-soaked ground." She paused, studying. Him? The man who'd opened his door and his heart. And you? Your home is gone, your solitude broken. Elias looked at the wreckage of his ranch. The fences he built to keep the world out now splintered. The cabin that had been his prison, no longer a refuge. He thought of Clara's laughter, Jonah's questions, and the women who'd reminded him what it meant to live for something beyond himself. "West," he said, "the word of promise, somewhere that needs a man who can build, who isn't afraid to fight. For what's right." Keona's smile was small but genuine, the first he'd seen, a spark of warmth in the cold dawn. "Lila, the camp follower, she needs someone to see her safe to Denver," she said, her voice soft but pointed. "The trail's no place for a woman and child alone." Elias nodded, understanding the task wasn't just protection but redemption. A chance to honor Clara's belief in him by ensuring others reached their future. As the Cheyenne women rode north, their silhouettes strong against the rising sun, Elias packed a saddlebag, his rifle and a few tools all that remained of his old life. The marshals took Harlan away in chains, his career shattered, his crimes laid bare by the courage of those he'd underestimated. Elias glanced back at the ranch one last time, its ruins a testament to the night he'd chosen to live again, to fight for strangers who'd become more than that. The snow began to melt under the sun's touch, revealing the earth beneath, scarred but enduring, much like the man who now turned west. Clara's voice guided Elias, no longer a ghost but a spark, urging him to build bridges between souls. The horizon promised danger and hope. The hermit was gone, replaced by a man who knew some fights were worth the cost. Riding toward Denver. To protect Lila and her daughter, the rising sun cast shadows of endings and new beginnings.